addressing today is the school to prison pipeline. But before we even talk about it, there's a video here. It was a short set done by NBC where they were addressing, they did a good job of taking a lot of the statistics and all of the studies. And this is just kind of a fact dump so that in 4 minutes you can find out get somewhat of an idea of what is going on, why this is, why we decided to call this a heroic strategy. And then inshallah after that, we'll get into a discussion about that.
America's public schools are failing students in multiple ways. One of the most disruptive is a process by which students are funneled out of the public school system and into the juvenile justice system. It's called the school to prison pipeline, and there is increasing evidence that it starts as early as preschool. The school to prison pipeline primarily victimizes Black students, trapping them in a cycle of discipline and incarceration, according to Dr. Kenneth D. Waters, diversity educator and researcher.
I want to believe that every student wants to overcome the societal conditions of what's placed on them because of their race, sex, and the socioeconomic status.
Increasingly, schools are cracking down on small offenses, such as cutting class or being disrespectful. This is supposed to discourage more serious infractions, like drug or weapons possession. What constitutes disobedience or disrespect can be very subjective. A study in Texas found that 97% of the state's suspensions were for subjective reasons, made at the discretion of school administrators. And Black students were 31% more likely to receive discretionary suspensions than white students.
And it obviously affects the individual who's actually entering the criminal system, but you're affecting communities, you're affecting the economy.
The disparity can start as early as preschool, when 48% of preschoolers who are suspended more than once are Black. Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than their white counterparts. And Black girls are suspended at higher rates than girls of any other race.
I want to believe every student is destined for success they want to achieve, but more times than not, we can't control certain things will happen in their homes. I had a student years ago, by the time they got to school, they said, hey, I walked through a crack house facility, prostitution. When I get here, I walk through a metal detector and people bother me. I haven't eaten since lunch yesterday. And you're asking me to sit here in class and learn? There's a challenge.
When students are kept out of school as punishment, they miss lessons and assignments and fall behind academically. They are also more likely to be disciplined again, which can lead to further problems. The Texas study found that students who had been suspended or expelled were twice as likely to drop out. Adding to the problem, police officers stationed inside schools to prevent serious crimes. When these officers react overzealously to minor infractions, they make small problems worse. Schools with officers have 5 times as many arrests for disorderly conduct as schools without them. But there are solutions.
We need more of our educators to take a genuine interest in the whole student, as opposed to what they would teach on the board and so forth. Not be quick to actually discipline them, but be more mindful of the predicament they may be coming from and have an understanding of why they're doing what they're doing. Now, I'm not saying take away the discipline, but as you're adding that disciplinary act or that consequence, you're explaining why am I doing this. You're explaining the reason I'm disciplining you is because this happened, and this is how you can fix this down the line. I'm showing a genuine interest of actually being restorative and helping you in moving forward so this won't happen again.
There are also proactive solutions, including hiring school guidance counselors instead of more police officers. Experts like chemists say the best way to prevent incarceration is to provide more equal educational opportunities and to create environments that support all students.
Hey, NBC News.
So that was, in those 4 minutes, they showed a number of statistics, a number of alarming statistics. And what many of us probably know is that the statistics which they were showing and the issues of those students who get arrested, who get into disciplinary issues, what you notice is that doesn't apply to all schools. In fact, if we go to most of the Muslim communities that we have, because this is in Texas, this convention is in Texas, in Houston and Dallas, those schools are probably not the ones that we'll find next to the large Islamic centers. These are, if we look at the breakdown online of the various school districts, and they break it down, I know in Texas they break it down based on income, right? So you have certain low-income schools. Even in one school district, you may have a lot of disparities between the income distribution. So based on that, when they were talking about schools with more police officers, that's the breakdown. Here in Texas, a lot of the schools in the more low-income areas, they have more police officers whose job it is basically to arrest students who are misbehaving, as opposed to going through the disciplinary process that their counterparts in the more affluent neighborhoods or the more affluent communities go to. So we're really blessed to have this panel here, and the reason is because this is something that Brother Abdul Aleem is knowledgeable about and very passionate about. Imam Khalid Briggs, I know whenever we introduce him, we always say, or at least I always say, this is an area of his expertise. But this topic is actually an area of his expertise because he worked in Winston-Salem. This is something that for many years he worked on. He worked with students, and especially students who had been through kind of this process, the disciplinary process, and also working with prison reform. So with that, we'll invite Brother Aleem first to share a few words, and then Imam Khalid, and then what we're going to do is have a discussion. We have a couple wireless mics, and this is something that everyone here is going to really have to be involved in because I'm sure everyone has things to say and things to ask about as well. And one more thing that I want to mention is because both of these gentlemen here, they're workers and they're planners, that in addition to just discussing this, I think we should also try to come up with some ideas on how we can combat this, because this is something that's very relevant in our communities as well. So that's just something I thought we should all keep in mind. So with that, I'll invite Brother Abdul Aleem to share a few words.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa barak wa sallam. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, we send praise and thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We send the prayers and blessings upon His Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, upon his family, and upon his companions. Ameen. I wanted to, first of all, thank Brother Musab and Brother Imam Griggs for allowing me to come and also be a part of this program. And I want to thank the attendees here because of the gravity and the importance of this type of program. My request to the audience and to ourselves is that we don't treat this session or look at this session as simply another lecture. My hope is that, inshallah, God willing, is that we can highlight the importance of this issue and possibly awaken a change in someone here, that we can impact the lives of young people who are going through very serious circumstances, especially at a very young age. And this circumstance that many of them are finding themselves in is of no fault of their own. They did nothing of their own volition to cause this to happen to them, but these are just symptoms of problems in society that have impacted their lives. And as a result, when we look at the trajectory of the impact and the effect that it has on them, we can see it manifest throughout society. If you don't mind, I wanted to sit while I speak because I do have some materials that I wanted to briefly show and highlight. And so, inshallah, we'll have a chance to see as well as hear what the issue is.
Viewers, thanks for checking out.
So, the question I think that we need to first ask ourselves is, what is the problem? Why do we consider schools to be a pipeline into the prison or correctional system? I think that the question kind of starts at the middle of the story, meaning that we see that students in school are experiencing issues, and there's a reaction from the school administration where administrators, educators, they have a program to deal with students who misbehave. So they kind of start with, they start from a disciplinary perspective, a corrective perspective, and then the student migrates through the system of how the system has decided to deal with certain behaviors. I think part of the issue is that we're looking at the behavior of students out of context. Out of context. Everything has to be viewed in context. So when I see a student who's misbehaving, I need to look at the underlying reasons why this student is displaying this behavior. And I need to try to understand what are the factors and how can I impact the student for positive change. If I simply deal with the symptoms that the student is displaying, then I'm going to probably miss the larger point and not resolve the issue. So one of the things that, and by the way, I just wanted to give a little background about myself to kind of put things into context, as I just said. So I was also a school teacher for 5 years in Baltimore, Maryland. I worked at a school called the Woodburn School. And the Woodburn School was what we call a residential treatment facility. This means that students, first of all, it was an all-male school, and the students lived on campus. We had a school and also a residential component where the students would receive counseling and, in some cases, medical attention to address their issues. These are students that were adjudicated through the state mostly, or from some healthcare institution. They all had a diagnosis, and a diagnosis just simply means that this child has been identified as having a clinical condition which requires special care and special treatment. All of our students, all of the boys who attended this school were diagnosed 06, which means it's an emotional disturbance. And when you look at the history of these students, you'll find that in many cases, there was some level of trauma or abuse in their upbringing that led to this stage in their life, or this phase, or this diagnosis that they've been given. So this school, and also I have some experience teaching in Sunday schools at various CSJ, kind of gives me the background perspective that I'm giving today, along with some information, some data. But what we will find is that a lot of young people experience trauma. They experience trauma. So the first question is, what is trauma? And this is an article that I recently found, and it's talking about childhood trauma. Trauma has been explained as, and I'll just read it directly, some type of abuse. One example is abuse. Sometimes it can be physical or sexual abuse. It can be something that, like a tragic event or some serious event that a child was not mentally, emotionally prepared to handle. Trauma can also be something that is ongoing and repetitive, such as an unstable household or some environmental factors that cause stress on a child, which leads to trauma. When trauma is extended over a period of time, it becomes a form of PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder, where this child experiences developmental challenges. They have issues forming healthy relationships with others. especially adults, especially if the trauma was caused as a result of adults in the child's life. And some of the information that is pointed out is that it says between 3 and 15% of girls and 1 to 6% of boys develop post-traumatic stress disorder following a traumatic event. So without weighing us down with just information from this article, as a former educator, I think what tends to happen is when children misbehave and they act out in the school environment, the question that we typically ask ourselves is, what is wrong with this child? And we deal with the child from a disciplinary, punitive perspective. When really the question, I think a better question would be, is what happened to this child? What caused this child to behave this way? Not what is wrong with the child, but what happened to this child? And when we start to think about the factors that cause the child to behave this way, we move away from a disciplinary perspective to more of a restorative and a rehabilitative perspective. I just wanted to share a couple of statistics. Some of these we kind of heard in the video, but I just wanted to highlight this as well. This first graph is showing the percentage of elementary and secondary school students who were retained or left behind, and it's separated by race or ethnicity. If you look at the black line, and I'll move it up just a little bit, this black line represents the total number of students who were left behind. This bottom line represents the white students who were retained or left behind. And one thing we can immediately notice is that this green line representing white students never rises above the national average. When you look at the top two lines, which represents black and Hispanics, you will see that there is a pattern between blacks and Hispanic students consistently exceeding the national average for students being left behind and students being retained in school. So already we can see a pattern of punitive and corrective behavior targeted towards black and Hispanic students. If we were to drill down a little further, you'll see that the second graph, which represents the percentage of elementary and secondary school students retained by grade and level, and also the racial ethnic group, you will see that when you look at, first of all, I'm trying to get this into me, see if I can get this to the right. So these blocks represent different ethnicities. And again, the black block represents the total number. The green represents white students. This teal color is black and the gray is Hispanic. In all cases, you'll see again that white students are below the national average. And in all cases, you'll see that the black student is above the average. And when it comes to Hispanic, in some cases, they are at or below the national average. And I'll show one more graph, and I think this one is most telling about the issue. This last graph, again, is showing by race or ethnicity the number of students in public school who were suspended, out of school suspension by race or ethnicity. This means that the student has been sent home and sent away from school because of disciplinary action. And again, the black represents the total, the green represents males, and the teal represents females. When you look at the numbers for white children, the black line represents that they are in total number below average. The male is again below the national average, and the female is about half the national average for all girls. When you look at black students, you can see that we are nearly 3 times the national average. For black males, again, we're twice as likely to be suspended and put out of school. And for black females, it's 3 times the likelihood. When you look at the national average of 3.2, the black female is at 9.6. 3 times the likelihood of being suspended from school. And again, for the Hispanic, you'll see that the numbers are pretty high, but they're still better than the national average in many cases. So the question that comes to my mind is, why the disparity? Is it because maybe there are more black students in school than other races? No. Black people are only about 13 to 15% of the total population. So it's not that we're more number to justify why it's happening more to black people. It can't be because of population. Is it because black children are by nature more rebellious, more violent, more disobedient than other students of other races? No, that cannot be the case. We know that this is not a genetic disorder. This is nothing tied to the race of the human being. Then there must be some other social construct that causes this phenomenon. Why is this happening more to black students and other students of other races? And that's the reason why we're having this discussion, to figure out what is the cause of this disparity, how can we address that? And when you think about the history of Pharaoh and how he dealt with the children of Israel, especially the boys, you'll find that there was a very strict law, and it was based out of fear that the children of Israel would somehow overturn and topple the kingdom of Pharaoh. And I won't go much further. I'll leave that for Imam Khalid and Brother Musab to go deeper. But I just wanted to give some background information as to highlight the problem itself, and for us to start thinking about how we can make a difference, make a change, to turn this trend around, and inshallah make a difference in the lives of young people. Jazakallah khair.
So with that, inshallah, we'll invite Imam Khalid to address this topic a little further, and then inshallah we'll break out into the discussion.
Walaikum salam.
Sleep this morning? Let's try it again. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Thank you so much. I want to make 2 points very clear at the beginning. I've been having problems with my throat. And as in the presentation that I made last night, the timekeeper didn't have to stop me. My voice actually stopped me. So inshallah it won't happen this morning. All of the many doctors who were present, they immediately started giving me medication. Inshallah, it'll work for me better this morning than it did before I took it last night. And the second thing that I want to make very clear is that from this presentation, I want to address a larger issue and then bring it down to the ground. As they say, I've heard that Southerners say, well, put the hay down where the goats can get it, and these kinds of things. I want to put where the rubber meets the road, to put this issue of this school to prison pipeline in a context, talking about how in the Quran gives us a kind of blueprint as to how Pharaoh addressed the issue of perceived opposition that he was going to take. So let's start on this journey. Just bear with me just for a few moments. I want to start with a story that for me really typifies the issue that we are addressing today. Because when you look at it, when you look at this issue of mass incarceration in this country, and when you look at the populations that are making up this mass incarcerated nation that we have here, how do we, as Americans, tolerate such a deplorable situation? Why? How is it that we can talk about having the largest incarcerated population on the planet, and such a disproportionate number of these folks either being black or Latino, and now other peoples of color? How could this nation, how could you, sitting here, how could you tolerate this? Let me start by a story. This is just a personal little anecdote. I was in the nation of Iran. I used to not say where I was, but now I'm just going to come on out with it. I was in the nation of Iran a number of years ago. And at this particular time, I was there as a guest of the government. The government of Iran invited people from around the world to come to look at what happened, what they had achieved in the Iranian Revolution. And one night, because it was very hot, and one night, we were walking around through the shopping areas, through the bazaars, and through the malls that were open at 2 and 3 in the morning, because people would come out at that time because it was a little cooler than walking around during the day. And the Muslim brother, who was assigned to the English-speaking group that I was a part of, came up beside me. We were walking, people having good conversation and all. And this young man walked up to me and said, excuse me, Imam Khalid, I want to ask you a question. I said, what's the question? He said, well, do you feel the inclination, or do you feel the urge to snatch one of these ladies' pocketbooks or to grab some of their bags that they've been shopping? And so I looked at the guy and I said at first, well, maybe he's trying to make a bad joke. So let me try to understand before I respond to him or bust him in his mouth. Let me understand the intent behind this question. And I said, well, brother, I don't quite understand. I mean, what are you saying? And the guy, in his ignorance, said, well, you're African American, right? You're black, right? I said, yeah, I'm black. He said, well, my understanding is that black people, especially men, are criminally inclined to do this kind of thing. Now, he addressed me first as not, hey, bub. At least he recognized that I was an imam. And I was a guest of the government that he is a part of. And this ignorant young kid would ask me, do I feel like I want to go out here and snatch somebody's pocketbook or bags and run back to the hotel? Is basically what he's asking me. And I think to understand why we as Americans are tolerating this horrible situation of mass incarceration, it starts right there. The perception is, across America, is that the people who are in jails and in prison need to be there because they've committed criminal offenses. And in particular, those African Americans are part of a population in this country that are more congenitally, just inherently inclined to commit criminal offenses than any other people in the country. In my humble opinion, in my years of working in prison advocacy, in my years of working in various populations, and trying to help others and myself come up with solutions, this is what I've come to. It's a sad realization for me. that at this stage in my life, this is what I've come to. I honestly believe that there's no outcry. There's no just protest in the street about what's going on in this incarceral system in this country because of the attitude, the stereotype that those people who are in these prisons deserve to be there. They're criminals. And so what do you do with criminals other than lock them up? So check yourself starting. That's the beginning of a process of being able to work towards constructive change in areas like this. Check yourself first. Check your attitude. Don't come up to me and ask me about, do I feel like when I go into bazaar stealing somebody's bag of goodies. It's rooted in a racist attitude and a racist behavior. And if you came into this room with that attitude, disabuse yourself of that first in order for you to be able to be a part of some kind of constructive reality and creating a different narrative about mass incarceration in this country. Let me go a little further. I really love history. And Brother Hasid knows I don't care what I'm talking about. You can tell me any topic. I'm going to have to go back in history on it. So I want to just go back just for a moment. And I want to put this idea of prison, school to prison pipeline and mass incarceration in an historical context that you and I need to understand. We are the Muslims. We are the ones that are to provide some kind of guidance for this nation. We're not followers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a book and a prophet that we can gather information and inspiration and guidelines from. We're not followers. So you are the ones to help bring about a change in some of the social realities that are infesting and are plaguing this nation. So let's go back real quickly. I don't know if you all know the Pharaonic story. I'm sure everybody knows it. I just want to point out just a few things. Right? You had this madman Pharaoh declaring himself, this particular Pharaoh, and all of them declaring themselves to be the manifestation of God on earth. The Quran talks about him, the Hadith literature talks about him. And so how this idea in the minds of this particular Pharaoh got there, that what I need to do is to kill the firstborn males and then later to kill all of them, was started all the way with the prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he had his wife Sarah and he was going through Egypt. And this crazy guy, who was the leader at this time, wanted to hit on his wife. He wanted to try to take his wife. And you know what happened to him. Allah put him in freeze mode. He couldn't move. Leave this woman alone. And Sarah was very patient through this process. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewarded Sarah by getting the glad news to her, the good tidings to her, that one of your progeny will be the one who will destroy this mad system that exists. And so this is what we know actually happened. One of the progeny of Sarah and Ibrahim alayhi salam was the one that brought this system down. So why did this particular Pharaoh get into all of this panic mode? Let me kill those boys. What caused that? You know, the Jewish people who were enslaved under the system were taught, they knew this story about Sarah. They were talking about it. And historically, we find that some of these leaders, these ministers of the Pharaoh, with their ears trying to see what these people were doing on the ground, heard the story that somebody's going to come from amongst them. So Pharaoh freaked out. He panicked. Okay, we got to do something about this. So he said, okay,
firstborn of those people, kill them. Right? It didn't stop the chatter. So then he gets a little more spooked out. He says, no, kill all of the males of these people. And the reason was he was so paranoid about someone coming to lead these people against this crazy system and destroying the system. And you know the rest of the story. So Pharaoh's inclination, it wasn't just that he hated Jewish boys. That was not it. He was afraid that because of this evil, unjust system and because of the promise that these people had been given by their Lord, that someone was going to come to destroy it, he freaked out. Now, Harun, alayhi salam, was born in a time when the Pharaoh had said, we'll do alternate years. We'll kill all of them 1 year, and then the next year we won't do it. We have a little amnesty for 1 year. Musa alayhi salam was born during a time when everybody, the males, were supposed to be killed. And you know the story of how his mother saved him in this process. Okay, so now, and I don't want to take too long here, because I got some other closer stuff to talk about, and I want to get to that before I lose my voice here. But, so we know what happened. We know the end of this particular story. The Coptic people, they're not Coptics, didn't just start with the Christians in Egypt. This is an ancient people with an ancient language and everything else. The Coptic people started complaining to the ministers and to the Pharaoh. How are we going to get our work done if you're killing all of these slave males? It's impacting our production. You're paralyzing our work. We don't work. We force other people to work for us. And you're killing the men. So how are we going to continue? So I make this as a point and I go on. But remember this point that I'm making right now. That there was a concern about the economic system. How are we going to survive if you're killing the slaves off, their men? Let's move forward. Let's jump across the Atlantic Ocean here just for a second. I don't know how many of you realize or understand what the system of incarceration, what the system of policing is even based on. Can I see the hands of anybody who knows the answer to this? Slavery. It's based on slavery. The police system in this country is a patrol system that was developed during the period of chattel slavery in this country. The first penitentiary, the first idea to incarcerate people for their crimes was developed, and I'm going quickly here, Brother Hassan, in 1790 in Philadelphia. It was this Walnut prison or jail. It was first for people, you had an offense, you get locked up, they hold you, and then they do what they do to you. What they were doing to people at this time, before 1790, what they were doing, people were a little fanatical. They would burn people, they would put them in stocks, they would publicly whip people, and what I'm talking about white people doing that to each other. Those who were incarcerated never got to a trial. They thought you did something. It was okay, that's your property. Do what you want to with your property. But the system of penitentiaries and locking people up for committed crimes started in about 1790. It evolved from a holding system before trial to penitentiaries. And so what evolved from this was this system of not just holding people, but locking them up. Rather than burning people, then let's do something else. At this particular time, and up to a point that I'll mention in a minute, 99% of the people who were incarcerated in this country were white folks. 99% after the U.S. Civil War, the numbers flipped to 99% of the people who were locked up in this country were now people of African descent. Civil War, white folks locked up. After Civil War, black folks locked up. And why? It were locked up because of the same reason that Pharaoh was concerned. Who was going to do my work? We had these slaves, but now they've been set free by this 13th Amendment. But oh no, it has a loophole. It says that slavery is forbidden in the country except for those who've committed crimes. So what happened? This government all across the South, they came up with these things called black codes that criminalize being black. Literally. You could not walk beside a railroad track. This is a crime. To walk beside a railroad track. You could not spit on the ground in public, as an example. You could not raise your voice in public, as an example, because these were offenses that were punishable by incarceration. And so by creating these codes after the Civil War and criminalized just the fact of being black, what's your job? Where are you working? Tell me who you're employed. If you're not working, you're going to jail. And so the industrialists at the time said, well, look, we may not be able to work slaves, technical slaves, but we can lease them from these prison colonies that have been established of free black folks who were being incarcerated and leased out. And so this goes on. It's a horrendous, bad system. And I'll just come up to the present, jump over some years and try to come more to the present. But the idea that I want you to get is that the model of mass incarceration and the people who are filling up prisons and jails across this country is a model that was designed by Pharaoh. If you can't get them off the street, just kill them. Okay? Let's move a little bit further. Brothers and sisters, in the 1970s, there was a president of the United States in the early 70s, first elected in 1968, that a lot of us used to refer to as Dirty Dick or Tricky Dick. It was Richard Nixon, Richard Milhouse Nixon. Until that person that we have in the White House today, in my lifetime, there was never a human being to occupy the White House worse than Richard Nixon. He's a horrible man. He's a terrible man. Richard Nixon he initiated a process in the early 1970s to try to reverse the tide of and the momentum from the Black freedom movement that was coming out of the 1960s and into that early 70s. He said, we got to find ways to stop this stuff, because the black folks are running wild and they're influencing these Native Americans and all these other people to start running wild. They're resisting us. And in this process, Nixon initiated. It didn't start with Bill Clinton. It didn't start back then. It started with Dirty Dick initiating a process of mass incarceration of black folks in this country. It continued through subsequent presidents. Each one of them, and Obama included, continued a process that said it's okay, that the system we have in place is okay. Now, I'm going to stop here in a second. But one of the things that, two things I want to point out. 5% of the world's population is here in the United States. 5%. 25% of the world's prison population is in the United States. 25%. I'm talking about all of the most authoritarian, dictatorial governments you can imagine. Pick a country. Nobody incarcerates more of its citizens than this country, to the tune of 2.4 to 2.6 million people in jails and prisons across the country. Almost 7 million people are under correctional supervision, meaning that they are on probation, they're on parole, and all of these things. Now, how, and quickly, how does this tie in to this school to prison pipeline? My brother has given some excellent statistics that it's not necessary for me to go through this, but just understand that by the time a child reaches the 3rd grade, those in corrections and responsible for correctional facilities have projected the number of prison beds that they will need in the next 10 years. By the time a child is in 3rd grade, and particularly based on reading scores, and I found that fascinating. Not math, not science, not home economics, but based on if a child can't read, can hardly read, by the 3rd grade, they are projecting the number of prison beds that are needed in 10 years. In 10 years. And so there have been those who've done some wonderful research. I mean, I've read a lot of stuff on this subject. But an old writer who wrote years ago, by the name out of Chicago, by the name of Jawanza Kunjufu, did some excellent work about this conspiracy to destroy black boys. And he talked about, and he was suggesting even as Malcolm articulated in a different kind of way, if you do you put your a cat into an oven and expect to get biscuits out? If it's a cat and you want something from it, you have to use the proper mechanism. What I'm saying is that the targeting that is done, particularly of black boys, and now is out insane with black girls as well. Well, I mean, I couldn't believe. I can't. That's tell me why. I don't want to put it like that. It was difficult to watch that police officer or school resource officer or whatever he was manhandled that black boy in that classroom, snatch him up out of his chair and beat him like he had stole something from his mom, to come in a classroom and be so bold that you think it's okay to abuse a child in front of all of these witnesses, and you think it's okay. So what we're seeing is, in my opinion, is a continuation of a model that was established in this country during the period of chattel slavery, and in that period immediately afterwards, to ensure that there be cheap, disposable labor, and that because these people are criminalized for walking down the street. Let me tell you this, just thought of another quick thing. A few years ago, I was directing a public school program. It wasn't residential, like a program where you were. But it was a part of the public school system. We were trying to get residential because we said we have to try to make a difference in the whole child. So we needed the whole day, the whole night, not just send them to us for a few hours and put them right back in the briar patch. And so I was working. I had hired this counselor. And the counselor was from somewhere in, backwoods Louisiana. And he told me about a town in Louisiana where he was growing up called Laughing Barrel, Louisiana. I said, Laughing Barrel, man, I've heard some names, some crazy names of towns, but why Laughing Barrel? This man, and he swore to God that he was telling the truth, that in Laughing Barrel, Louisiana, up until the 1950s and maybe into the early 60s, in this little village that I think may have been incorporated by some other city, whatever was closer to it, they had these barrels on the streets in downtown. And if a black person wanted to laugh about something, if you're walking with your friend and somebody tells a joke and you want to laugh, you had to go to one of these barrels and stick your head in the barrel and laugh so you don't disturb the good white folks walking around in the town. This is in the 1950s or the 1960s in the United States. Laughing Barrel, Louisiana. Very similar to the black codes. Very similar. Lock them up because they're black. Whatever they do, if you don't see them doing something, you know they're going to do something, or they've done something in the past and just found a reason to just go ahead and lock them up. I'll close on this particular note. 2 notes. One, I stand by what I said at the very beginning. If you have come into this room with the stereotype that African American and Latinos are criminally inclined, so therefore they deserve to be the predominant numbers in incarceration, I'm not saying you are a racist, but you have a racist attitude that you need to expunge from your system. You really need to disabuse yourself of this notion. If you do not, you will not be able to effectively help bring about a change, because in your mind, you still think that them black folks need to be locked up, those Latinos need to be locked up. You can't bring about effective change. Secondly, the system of mass incarceration in this country, the system in the criminal justice process itself, in my humble opinion, it is beyond reform. It's beyond reform. You can't, and we can't put a Band-Aid over the system and think that it's going to change. It requires major revolutionary kind of changes if we expect for the system of mass incarceration as it presently exists not to continue into the present. And so now I'll sit down and hopefully we will think, and together we'll come up with some ideas, some plans. What can we do as individuals? What can we get with other people to do to help effectuate change? But it starts with being educated about the problem itself and the origins of the problem. That's all I can put on.
So we have about 20 minutes left in the session, give or take. So now we have 2 wireless mics. So if anyone has any questions or comments, you can tell just by the brief talk by both of the speakers that they're probably, any question you have, I'm pretty sure we'll have an answer.